You might have heard about this, but there's a new Supergirl movie coming out. Yeah, I know. News to me too. Well, not really. The new movie, based on Tom King's Supergirl, Women of Tomorrow comic, will be directed by the Academy Award-winning director of I, Tonya and Cruella, Craig Gillespie. And it looks like it's going to stick close to the comic, though it will be incorporating more of a sci-fi aesthetic as opposed to the comic's more planetary romance aesthetic that it had previously. What I expected, of course, were fans to discuss how the comic was being brought to life, right down to the train that Supergirl gets on, because she's on a planet with a red sun and can't fly and her ship gets hijacked. Those small plot details are being translated directly in this new world. However, I'm not seeing that discussion among the usual suspects. Rather, I'm seeing a lot of these grifter types talk about how the film is being ruined by James Gunn. How James Gunn's aesthetic is destroying the fledgling DC universe.
You know, it's interesting how a movie that was, officially at least, neither written nor directed by James Gunn is somehow shaping up to be the most James Gunn movie that ever James Gunned. I don't know how else to say it, but the trailer that just got released yesterday is basically a comprehensive checklist of every tired, played out James Gunn cliche from every superhero movie he's ever made.
Which I think is, as you can imagine, quite short-sighted. A vast majority of these complaints are not rooted in reality. For example, this comment about James Gunn and dogs.
There's the dog to kick things off, because there's always a dog in a James Gunn movie, because everyone knows that putting a cute furry animal in your movie is pretty much the quickest and laziest way of speedrunning your way to audience sympathies.
There are maybe 2 James Gunn movies that feature dogs prominently, that being Guardians of the Galaxy 3 and Superman. If you count scripts, I guess you can count Scooby-Doo, but you know, that was kind of with the territory, I guess. A common thing I'm seeing? People's pointing to how the Supergirl trailer has a Blondie song in it.
We've got the obnoxious use of 1980s pop songs, because by golly, James Gunn sure does love his classic pop music.
And because James Gunn loves putting needle drops in his movies, that means it must be just like a James Gunn film. Except, you know, Craig Gillespie also uses pop music in his films. Gillespie's Cruella, for example, featured songs by Florence and the Machine, the Bee Gees, the Doors, Tina Turner, Queen, the Electric Light Orchestra, among others. Gillespie uses just many needle drops, as James Gunn does. So what's the issue? Is the sci-fi elements? Well, it's a sci-fi story. It's gonna have sci-fi elements. Most of the trailer, like I said, has stuff directly for the comics. The characterization of Supergirl as a survivor of a dead world who finds solace at the bottom of a bottle before finding catharsis, helping a similarly lost soul find closure again with their own personal tragedy, it comes directly from the comic. James Gunn has deliberately put himself away from the spotlight. He's taken himself off of center stage for 2026, with Supergirl, Lanterns, and Clayface all being productions with minimal Gunn involvement creatively, as opposed to 2025, where Superman and Peacemaker were both directed and written, in part or in all, by Gunn. Which begs the question, do these critics read comics? Well, that's a silly question. Of course they don't. But I want to point out right here, there is a degree of fairness. After all, under Zack Snyder, there were few pop songs in his movies, right? There weren't that many pop songs in Snyder's promotion, mostly orchestral renditions of what was going to be in the films themselves. Except, you know, the trailer for Justice League, which had the song Come Together, and of course, you know, Watchmen had a song in it. You know, in hindsight, I'm starting to think that there were more exceptions than examples of the previous continuity where they had songs in the trailer. So, the difference might be jarring if you're accustomed to that previous era of DC. Sometimes. Of course, the Suicide Squad had pop music attached to it, but then again, that turned out to be The Suicide Squad, one of the worst DC films of all time. I'm noticing a pattern here now. And to offer a degree of fairness to Gunn's critics, some of the alien designs do look like they could have just come off the set of Guardians of the Galaxy. Then again, they could have also come off of the set of Enemy Mine, or for those who are not as steeped into 80s sci-fi as I am, Star Trek. Actually, that's also 80s nostalgia there too. I'm digressing. Still, James Gunn is the new face of the new DCU. Some people love it, some people hate it. Most people love it, based on the reception Superman got, but I digress. I've noticed a vocal side of the fandom, the Snyder fans specifically, who hate the new direction DC's going in. And grifters have noticed, especially critical drinker.
For all Zack Snyder's faults as a storyteller, and believe me, there are many, one thing you can't accuse the guy of is insincerity. His films might be slow, bloated, self-important, dour and overly serious, but you can tell he's 100% committed to the story he's telling, and there's a kind of simplistic honesty in what he does. We even ran a poll on Open Bar a few weeks ago asking the audience if they preferred Man of Steel, a movie that's been thoroughly shit on over the years, or James Gunn's Superman by James Gunn, and the results were like 90% in favour of Man of Steel. That's not an endorsement of Man of Steel, it's an indictment of James Gunn's Superman and everything that it represents.
This entire division is driven mostly by fans of Zack Snyder and fans of James Gunn, each of whom say that James Gunn either ruined or improved this franchise, this shared universe.
Because when you get right down to it, I honestly think most people would choose deeply flawed sincerity over polished duplicity.
This is all artificial, of course. Zack Snyder and James Gunn are friends. The two worked together on the Dawn of the Dead remake, with Zack Snyder directing and James Gunn writing, and I think it's one of their best films collectively. But how is Zack Snyder's world different from James Gunn's? What are the core pillars that define each? It's not just Snyder's world is dark and dramatic while Gunn's is light and optimistic. That isn't it, there's more going on here. The DCEU had a lot of levity to it too. If you look beyond the films Zack Snyder just directed, there's a lot of levity in the DCEU. I mean, we're looking at films James Gunn didn't direct and saying he's accountable. Wanted the same for Snyder. I mean, after all, Aquaman, Birds of Prey, Shazam, The Suicide Squad, Wonder Woman, all of them had levity and comedy there. So, the world's not all that bleak. There is optimism, even if it is disjointed from what came before, because a lot of the optimism was inserted into the films as a response to the critical reception Zack Snyder's films got initially. In many ways, the reception the DCEU is getting reminds me of the reception the Star Wars prequels got after the sequels came out, where fans were disappointed with some of the choices the sequels made and looked to the original films that they lambasted previously with a little bit more fondness. But the difference is, the DCEU is not as bad as the prequels with Star Wars. Hot take, I know. I enjoyed a lot of the DCEU films for the most part before Gunn took over, so I'm coming at this with a perspective of admiration for both sagas. To some extent. I do feel these interpretations of characters have a lot in common too, in part because some elements are in canon between the two universes. For example, everything with Task Force X, the Suicide Squad, everything with Amanda Waller, everything with Peacemaker, that's canon in both universes, with a cutting off point at some point when Creature Commandos came out and Peacemaker Season 2 came out. That's all under Gunn's world.
Are these Nazis, General?
They're even common conflicts. Both have the government turned against metahumans. Both Superman and Batman v Superman show what happens when the public is turned against the Man of Steel. But there are some major differences in terms of plot structure, characterization, tone, and so much more. One of the big ones, though, that has a ripple effect around the world: how long have metahumans been here? Man of Steel introduces metahumans to the world, with Superman becoming the new savior. He arrives at a world that has metahumans in it, but we don't know that yet. And the greater world also doesn't know that yet. Metahumans are a surprisingly well-kept secret in the world of Man of Steel, though we don't know that until later because retcons. As such, the Battle of Metropolis is an upheaval. It changes the fabric of the world, the foundation upon which everything is built. Whereas in Superman, metahumans are an accepted fact of society. Superman's arrival 3 years prior didn't change the status quo as much as Superman's arrival in Man of Steel does. Because of this, Snyder's DCEU slowly reveals metahumans have been among us this whole time. Batman, a hero who's been active for decades prior to Superman's arrival, has to contend with a changing world, slowly coming to terms with the full weight of that revelation. Meanwhile, Superman's arrival in James Gunn's universe is an easier pill to swallow because, the existence of Themyscira is already well known. We've had superheroes and metahumans since the 1800s so far, as we see in Creature Commandos. In fact, robots turned the tide of World War II, and it's just a commonly known fact.
Are these Nazis, General?
This decision, the choice to start with First Contact or enter a world where metahumans are accepted, completely alters how we see these two worlds. Man of Steel carries with it gravitas purely because everything here is revolutionary to this world. The Battle of Metropolis is a massive upheaval. One of the best decisions Snyder did during his tenure was to start Batman v Superman from a different perspective of the Battle of Metropolis from the previous film. Prior, we saw it from a bird's eye view, this destructive, massive event, from the hero's eyes, from a god's perspective looking down. And thus, looking at it from a different angle fills in the blanks that audiences had with that scene. A lot of people were kind of upset that Superman and Zod were clobbering through buildings with no regard for human life. Batman v Superman shows, here's the cost of a fight like that. And this feeds into BVS, where we see committees of people meeting to figure out what to do with Superman. We have talk shows talking about, must there be a Superman? And of course we have Lex Luthor, who is a hater as always, though I would say much less compelling in BVS than in Superman. I'll get to that. The weight of Superman's actions impacts everything, which leads to a problem we'll get to later. Gunn's world, by contrast, feels a little more casual. A kaiju attacks Metropolis one day, the ground splits open into a multiversal black hole the next day, but people treat it more like a hurricane in Florida. It's destructive, yeah, but they've gotten a handle on what to do when it happens. And because the film doesn't need to worry about the impact of every instance of superheroics, we can instead focus on the character's humanity, on human conflict, on interpersonal conflict, because that is the driving force of Gunn's world. I've always heard it said that the difference between Marvel and DC is that Marvel is about normal people trying to be like gods, and DC is about gods trying to be human. And I think Gunn and Snyder understand that, but take it in different directions. Gunn gets that not every metahuman is like a god in DC, and that's where things get complicated, because that's not the case for Snyder. See, Gunn has always been a fan of the glupshido characters, the people who are just sort of there and weird, like Metamorpho, Mr. Terrific. The Guardians of the Galaxy is entirely comprised of nebulous, obscure characters from Marvel who aren't exactly icons in the comics. Before 2014, you would not get an answer if you asked who Star-Lord is to the average human. Hell, even the average comic fan might not know who he was. Maybe fighting game fans might know about Rocket Raccoon because of Marvel vs. Capcom, but I digress. Anyway, James Gunn's DCU follows suit. It takes obscure characters from DC's catalog and puts them front and center. Or lesser known characters anyway. In Superman, we get an understanding of how Superman is important because he's contrasted with lesser heroes. Well, not lesser, but less powerful, I would say. Each hero has their own skill set. Every metahuman has their own abilities, but Superman stands in contrast to them. I think it's great having Guy Gardner, Hawkgirl, and Mr. Terrific as foils to Superman, as opposed to Batman and Wonder Woman like in BVS, and especially in that first film. If they introduced a ton of the major characters all at once, it wouldn't just feel crowded, Superman would feel less special. Mr. Terrific, his origins and motives don't matter, at least in this film. We can just accept, oh, he's another superhero, and he has unique powers that we can see demonstrated in front of us.
There are feelings and there are thoughts. Your feelings about feeling bad are okay.
Gunn understands that the focus of a Superman movie needs to be centered on Superman, his emotional journey specifically. It focuses on his kindness, on the way he tries to do the best he can, but the world gets in the way sometimes, or the world refuses to understand him, or his rivalry with Lex Luthor, or on his love life with Lois Lane, on how he interacts with the greater world of metahumans. Man of Steel, on the other hand, is about first contact, and how humanity as a collective responds to a god. It doesn't focus on the Superman character. Superman could be Martian Manhunter, and Zod could be the White Martians, and there'd be no meaningful difference. Superman could be Hal Jordan with the Green Lantern ring, fighting off Sinestro, and there'd be no difference. You see the problem with this? That's the big takeaway from these films. The DCEU is just one core story told multiple times. First contact, worlds collide. Man of Steel, it's a first contact story with aliens. Batman v Superman, the world reacting to first contact with aliens. Wonder Woman is about a woman from another world colliding with our world. Aquaman, Atlantis colliding with our true, normal society. Justice League, about metahumans learning to live together while dealing with Darkseid and his world of apocalypse colliding with ours. Worlds collide. First contact. Over and over again. It's the introduction to the greater world, consistently, with the normal world being changed by these interactions. But we never see how that lingers. The world never becomes accustomed to metahumans. Aquaman 2 and Shazam 2, even at the end of the DCEU, it's a world collide story. It's first contact with a hidden society. Even Atlantis is having a worlds collide story with a super hidden secret world under Atlantis or whatever. You know, it's ridiculous. Shazam, new gods introduced. It's the same story repeatedly. And the normal world barely changes from film to film. Outside of the Suicide Squad films, the Harley Quinn films, it feels like every time a new world collides with the DCEU, it's the first time. It is first contact. Even if there's superheroes established in the world. If there's a normal world being impacted by all of this, at a certain point, when do we stop having first contacts? When can't we just exist in the world forever shaped by all of this? Amanda Waller is the closest thread we get to what the world is like after all these interactions with metahumans, and even then, she's not in enough of it. As the world continues, it gets ridiculous. Dr. Fate has existed for decades in this world, but Superman changes everything? Dr. Fate? Martian Manhunter's been here the whole time? There's Green Lanterns on Earth? But Superman is first contact? With each new film, the impact of Man of Steel feels diminished. Also, the best DCE movie? It's Shazam. First one specifically, because it has some of the best character writing of the series. And the reason Shazam 2 feels like such a drop-off is because they forgot to develop Billy Babson's character, where Billy and Shazam feel like the same person, and Shazam doesn't feel like, a caricature of a man-child, like a raving, crazy man-child, where Billy feels normal and grounded. I think that by taking the first contact story off the table, Gunn can move past that and tell stories that feel like stories that function in an established world. We can skip the Spider-Man 1s and get into the Spider-Man 2s, stories that advance character. And Batman v Superman, 80% of Lex Luthor's dialogue is centered on existential dread because a man who once thought he was the smartest guy in the room feels insufficient in the face of a god. We feel his terror even as he's rambling like a weirdo. However, in Superman, we meet a Lex Luthor who's gotten over his initial shock and can play chess with the metahumans, all while being the world's pettiest hater. And that's great, because now we're not getting Lex Luthor with the weird billionaire, the eccentric billionaire Facebook guy. No, we're seeing Lex Luthor versus Superman. We're seeing two people, two icons, two pillars fight at the fullest of their capabilities, just like in the comics. Come to think of it, Snyder's world sucked when it came to villains. Lex Luthor is one of the most embarrassing, impotent figures in that world. He's stupid, rambling. His plan only works if everyone around him's a moron. He's powerless, vulnerable, out of his league. The Cheetah barely exists in Wonder Woman 1984, and they only fight once and then that's it. The Joker and Batman never fight each other. There's the chase scene in Suicide Squad, sure, but they never actually fight. Harley Quinn's biggest enemy isn't Batman and it's not Joker, it's Black Mask. Shazam never fights Black Adam, but Black Adam set to fight Superman. That never happens, of course, though. Bizarrely enough, Zod is the biggest threat Superman faces, both as Zod himself and later as Doomsday. He even comes back in The Flash. The only films that do villains right, in my opinion, are the Aquaman films, where we develop Ocean Master and Black Manta over 2 films, with a dynamic that shifts and evolves from event to event. That's compelling. But other than that, the villains in this saga are terrible. And that's because, again, these stories are ultimately always first contact narratives that are more focused on the impact these characters have over the world instead of the interpersonal conflicts or the internal conflicts. Meanwhile, in Gunn's world, we know Gorilla Grodd and Circe exist before we've met the Flash or Wonder Woman. You could say that's bad, but at least it establishes these characters have a world, that they come from something, and that we're anticipating their eventual meetup. Whether that actually happens remains to be seen. We spend so many films watching the world become what Gunn's DC starts as. James Gunn wants to bring the world of the DC Comics to life. He cites specific comics he lifts inspiration from. Supergirl is a direct adaptation of a Tom King miniseries. Meanwhile, Snyder wanted to make Excalibur. That's not to say Snyder never read the comics or adapted them. Noticeably, 2 of his early films, 300 and Watchmen, are basically panel-for-panel recreations of the original graphic novel. However, what I'm saying is, he didn't take this approach with the DC films, and in fact deviated quite far from both the spirit and imagery of those original comics. Excalibur is a plot-driven epic film from the 80s that adapts the whole of Le Morte Author in one 2-hour spectacle. It's all plot, rushing, but character, forget it. We see how Arthur's actions influence the world, sure, but we seldom see how Arthur is driven to act in certain ways, because the whole story goes through the events of the legends in speedrun format. We have to get to the next moment. Guinevere's betrayal matters less than the impact Guinevere's betrayal has on Camelot. As such, none of the romance matters. This is also true in DCEU, actually, because none of the romance in that mattered either. Hell, what's her name disappears from Aquaman 2, basically, because of Amber Heard's controversies. The Steve Trevor subplot becomes a cancer in 1984, but the worst offender is Lois Lane in Man of Steel. Or rather, the 3 Superman movies, anyway. In that first one, Amy Adams is given something to work with, sure, but as the films go on, she has less and less of a role. By the time we get to BVS, all Lois Lane is an anchor to root Superman to humanity. This is opposed to every other version of Lois Lane. The Christopher Reeve film, the DCEU, the My Adventure with Superman Lois Lane, and of course, James Gunn's Superman has a Lois Lane who is fleshed out, who has wants and desires, insecurities, fears, and all of it plays out in front of us in a compelling, meaningful manner. But in the Snyder films, what is Lois Lane's fear? What is Lois Lane's wants? What does Lois Lane do? They cut out her entire subplot from BVS for the most part, where she investigates Lex Luthor. But even with that in, what is actually brought to the surface by her? What do we actually learn about the world thanks to Lois Lane's actions? What do we learn about Lois Lane thanks to her actions? Not a whole lot. As a result, the world of Snyder's Superman feels lifeless. It feels soulless. Superman only functions as an asset of the world, as an embodiment of First Contact. He doesn't have much internal drive, and the world around him only exists in relation to him. There is no world that continues when Superman's asleep. Superman is ultimately the world. When Superman dies in BVS, it feels like we don't know where it's going to go next. We have to be introduced to a whole nother set of characters for the world to keep turning in Justice League. The entire first half of Justice League is spent introducing us to a world that should have been obvious by this point, to characters that we should have known by now. And as a result, we're left spinning our wheels, waiting for the team to get together. And by the time the team gets together, what do they actually do, right? The trinity of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman feels disconnected. Wonder Woman especially feels disconnected, because in each film, it's like we're getting introduced to a new character, right? Even Patty Jenkins' 2 films, she's not the same. The first one's a naive hero, being introduced to a new world for the first time. Again, a Worlds Collide narrative. And in the second movie, an element of Themyscira, of that wishing stone, collides in our world and shifts things. Again, a Worlds Collide story. But as a result, we see Diana take over the mind of an innocent bystander to shove Steve Trevor's brain into a body, that just so she can be with her dead boyfriend and be intimate with him, even though it's someone else's body and not Steve Trevor's. And no one acknowledges how creepy this is, because I guess the world's so soulless that just shifting a name, it's a really weird decision. I don't understand why no one actually pointed out how bizarre that script is for Wonder Woman to eagerly want a person's brain eclipsed by her dead boyfriend, who's been dead for decades at that point. It's really weird. It ultimately feels incohesive. Not incoherent, incohesive. But that's one thing that James Gunn's world is not. It's not incohesive, because Gunn's world is more cohesive. We know the major players. They've been set up. And we know that the other players can be introduced in this world in a way that's effective. It feels like each film and each show has substantially advanced the world in a way where it feels like everything is impacted by something else. Unlike Aquaman, where you have multiple global events happen and no one's affected, no one cares. Unlike Black Adam, where you have Superman being brought in to deal with a problem, but no one outside that film seems to care. Even though we've introduced that hell exists and Dr. Fate can rewrite time and reality and see the future. Doesn't matter. It's a world being run through speedrunning, and thus all these different pieces and threads don't connect. Unlike in James Gunn's world, where Superman has ramifications for Peacemaker and Supergirl and even Lanterns, we are affected by what happens in Creature Commandos. Everything feels connected. Supergirl, Peacemaker, Creature Commandos, Lanterns, everything feels connected. Even the Suicide Squad and the first season of Peacemaker impacts what happens in these movies. We see the government advance from film to film, see them introduce new ideas. We see Lex Luthor evolve past Superman. The villains have arcs outside their heroes, as seen with Cersei, as seen with Clayface, as seen again with Lex Luthor. So despite many people complaining about Gunn's aesthetic in Supergirl, at least it's cohesive to the rest of the world. We know who Supergirl is. We know how she got there. We are familiar with her before we see her. So what can Supergirl's trailer tell us about the future of this franchise? Well, a lot, thankfully. For one, we see a universe that has a degree of interconnectivity, like we established before. Think about it, we rarely see space in Snyder's universe, right? At least not as some lived-in concept. We see space structures, but not a lived-in world. We see Krypton colonizing dead worlds, and we see Apocalypse, but that's not really a developed territory. The closest we come, again, is Darkseid, but that's very limited. It's a very narrow window into space. However, this film opens it up. Compare that to the MCU for a second, too, where 4 films in we get Thor, a movie that introduces us to the cosmos of this world, and it just gets bigger from there. Gunn is planning on making space just an extension of the world on Earth, as opposed to something distant and far away. After all, we have Green Lanterns here. We know aliens are around. For another, we're getting characters who feel impacted by their past. When Supergirl's introduced in The Flash, she's lightly characterized as a traumatized warrior. Here, though, we're going to see Supergirl coping with trauma, coping with pain, and relating to others through that common experience, seeking mutual catharsis. But most importantly, we're going to be introduced to characters we normally wouldn't. I mean, look at Lobo. Lobo's in the trailer. Who'd imagine that? Played by Jason Momoa. Lanterns also helps us understand Gunn's world better. Since that world has existed for some time, we can explore the concept of legacy characters. Snyder's world always felt too young to establish a sense of legacy. But with Lanterns, we're going to see Jon Stewart taking on the ropes from Hal Jordan. We know that Guy Gardner's there. There are multiple Green Lanterns, all with the same moniker. Maybe we'll have that happen with Robin, too, as it's being set up with Brave and the Bold, eventually. Even Creature Commandos shows the century-spanning history of metahumans, with the roles that Frankenstein plays, with G.I. Robot in World War II. We see that world events have been forever shifted by metahuman interaction. There's a world layered in legacy. Everything feels weighty. The world isn't too young to bring Robin in. It's not too young to bring in a second Flash, to bring in a third Green Lantern. It's going to be satisfying seeing a team up of the world's greatest heroes in Justice League. Among the heroes and metahumans, there are specific titans among them. A trinity. Several more who stand above the rest, who feel like gods among the metahuman world. Rather than be the culmination of a trilogy that hastily introduces this whole universe, we have a shared interconnected world where things can breathe. Gunn is saving the DCU not by making it optimistic and bright, but by making it cohesive and layered, as well, most importantly, as human.
I got emotional a second ago because I really do think that what this movie is about is why do we love Superman so much? Is it because he can punch planets or pick up skyscrapers? I don't think it is. I think it's because of his innate goodness and his humanity.
Because we're moving away from having to introduce all these ideas in this first contact story, how the metahuman arrival impacts the world, we can focus in on making it feel lived in, on making each component feel connected and organic. He has saved it by bringing humanity to it. And humanity is the key element that all spectacle-driven films lack. For as beautiful as Man of Steel might be, as epic as it might be, all those stills of the characters walking by and being badass, there is not a soul to it. There's not a spark of sincerity to it. There is a spark of self-importance, of spectacle, but there is not that spark where you can imagine watching these characters when the dust settles, sitting down, and taking in what they experienced meaningfully. Consider this. In Batman v Superman, when that bomb blows up in the courtroom, we see Superman stand there and look stoic. We see less emotion from him than we'd see from David Corenswet's Superman when a kaiju dies. We have a 12-minute scene in Superman where Lois Lane and Clark talk. 12 minutes. No action, no fighting, and you don't even realize it's 12 minutes long, do you? It's a thrilling moment. It's full of character, warmth, but we don't see anyone throw a punch. That would be really bad in your typical superhero film, typically. But you don't notice it because it's so well written with characterization. That is what James Gunn brings. Humanity. It's not the spectacle. It's not the 80s music or any of that bullshit. It's simply humanity.
Like, you know, are you nostalgic? Like, I'm a huge Excalibur fan. I love Excalibur. I love John Borman. I love Excalibur.
I love Excalibur.